Hi, folks. Apologies for the delay in getting the episode out. I had it all cut, but not edited before I went to work last night. My plan was, well, since we've been, doing short shifts, or at the most working 8 hours, I'd cut it. And then when I got home, edit and post it. Well, I got to work last night and discovered that no, not only am I going to have to put in 13 hours, but I'm going to have to do that for probably the rest of the week. We're a little short of help, and we may have suddenly gotten a lot shorter. So, my choices were to either delay putting the episode out until Friday or Saturday, and then pump out another one on Sunday, or put it out today with no editing. As you can tell, I've opted to put this one out without editing. My apologies, but I have found the longer I go without putting out an episode, the fewer listeners I have, and I've put in 13 hours and I'm exhausted. I've got to sleep. I will be putting in 13 hours tonight, I'm sure, or at least 12. So, there's no other way I can get this out than just to put it out without the editing. Not a lot of mistakes or anything like that would need to be trimmed. A few bits and pieces here and there, and somebody banged the microphone stand a couple of times with their tail while I was recording. So you'll hear some weird noises, but that's just the way it is, and I think y'all can understand why I'm so fucking tired. So, without further ado, here's the episode. Alan Bean, the fourth man to walk on the moon, has died. Of the dozen men who've walked on the moon, only 4 now survive. It's anybody's guess if anyone from the Apollo program will be left alive when humans next step foot on the moon. If we ever do.
You don't have to be poor anymore. Jesus is here. The loudspeaker spoke up and said, Christianity is stupid.
Greetings, fellow worker slaves, podcasting at 128 kilobits from the Fortress of Squalitude, not far from the Redneck Mecca. This is the Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is probably curled up asleep on the bookshelf in my bedroom. Buttons is giving herself a bath on a box in the living room. Leela and Duracell are both outside. Yes, Duracell is fine. He's still around, as is Leela. He just pounded on the door a little while ago demanding to be fed. So that's a relief for me. And this is going to be a bit of a grab bag episode. I have had a busy weekend trying to take care of shit around the house. So I did not have time to prepare as well as I would have liked. My apologies, but I think you can kind of understand with the stuff I've been going through here of late. I did finally manage to track down my landlord this past week and talk to him about the deck and the steps. He was busy, so he couldn't give me an exact total for what the cost was or how much I still owed him. He thought that it was $600 for the whole thing and that I've paid most of it off. As for the steps, his answer boiled down to, fuck you, I just didn't like them. He tried claiming that they weren't up to code, despite the fact that they were almost identical to the ones which were there when I bought the place. He then said that he thought that they were falling apart, which they weren't. I overbuilt the steps because I didn't want to have to worry about them collapsing. They also had a deeper tread than the ones that he installed. And as I predicted, he's left for vacation this week, so we'll have to see if I get an eviction notice or not. Like I said before, he's passive-aggressive when it comes to eviction notices, timing them so that when they go out, he's on vacation, thus cutting into the amount of time you have to try and negotiate things with him. I didn't bother asking him if he was planning on evicting me because I know that he wouldn't have given me a straight answer on the subject either. Why he'd want to evict me, I don't really know, but clearly something's up. He's suddenly been doing a lot of work around the park, which leads me to think that he might be putting it up for sale and be wanting to get rid of certain people just for whatever reason. Although I have to think that if he's going to be booting anybody under such a circumstances, it would be the guy that's the registered sex offender who lives in the park and who has a trailer that's in a lot worse shape than mine, so. But you never fucking know. Well, between work being slow and my having to repay him for the deck roof, my car fund has unfortunately been wiped out. I've also had to get a few things for around the house that I hadn't planned on, which hasn't helped my cash flow situation. There is some good news, however. The first is that despite the fact that I only worked 4 days last week, I'll be getting a slightly bigger paycheck than I have the past couple of weeks. For reasons known only to management, they decided to have us work a 12-hour day one day, and anything over 8 hours is automatically overtime. So even though I put in roughly the same amount of hours that I have been, I get extra money on my next check. Thank you, union contract. The podcast has also picked up a new Patreon supporter, George, and I want to thank him for his support of the show. That brings me up to a total of 15 Patreon supporters and ties this show with the podcast that inspired me to start doing my own. Longtime listeners will recall that I heard an episode of an atheist podcast where the host read an email pointing out that they'd gotten something completely wrong about a news story, and rather than thanking the person for this, their attitude was, yeah, well, we really don't care. Then they said that they had to make $400 an episode or they'd quit doing the podcast. At that point, I said, if I could make an extra $400 a month, I could move out of this beer can, and I'll at least do what I can to get my facts straight. Now, dollar-wise, I'm not bringing in as much as they are via Patreon, but I'm close. They get $39 an episode, and I get $37. No idea what they get via other sources or what their download numbers are, but it feels good to know that I'm nibbling at their heels. And as you're no doubt able to tell, I don't sound any different than I did last week. I have not, despite my best efforts, been able to solve the software issues I've been having. I contacted the manufacturer of some of the hardware, and they said that it was a known issue. Microsoft hasn't been forthcoming about what they changed with the latest patch, so they couldn't give me a firm answer as to how to fix the problem. They did give me a link to an updated driver, which I downloaded and installed, but it didn't fix the problem. In checking Microsoft support pages, a lot of people are having the same problems I am, and nobody has an answer on how to fix it. I also tried installing a version of Linux on one of my other machines to see if that would solve my problem, and it didn't. This doesn't mean that my gear is bad. Linux often has trouble with such things, and different versions of Linux are better at handling some types of hardware than others. I've got more Linux versions I can try when I get the time. Frustratingly, I got an email this weekend from one of the big electronics retailers that's having a 3-day sale on MacBook Airs. If I wasn't paying my landlord back for the deck roof, I could easily have afforded to get one and still have money in my car fund. That's how cheap they were letting these things go. A Mac almost certainly would solve my problem, so I'll just have to keep trying Linux versions or hope that Microsoft issues a patch that fixes the problem between now and whenever the next time somebody has a really good sale on a Mac. And while we're on the subject of software issues, everybody out there needs to reboot their routers. It seems that Russian malware has been found on a number of routers, and the experts are saying that you need to reboot your router to get rid of it. Evidently, it's pretty hard for the malware to get written to the firmware on the router, so rebooting it will wipe it out. I'll have a link in the show notes with all the details. And I don't know if I mentioned this on the last episode or not, but my stepmother has finally started inching towards admitting that my father is dying. I got a text saying that they'd gone to the oncologist and were told that the doctor didn't think any treatments would help my father, either in terms of treating his cancer or improving his quality of life in the time he has left. And she gave no information as to how long that might be. She said that they were still evaluating their options, so I don't know if that means they're going to talk to other oncologists, they're going to try quack medical treatments, or she's just saying that because it's a comforting lie. My stepmother lost her first husband to stomach cancer back in the late 70s, so she's well familiar with the situation she's facing now. As for me, I still have no desire to speak to my father. He is a cruel man who cares more about his own happiness than that of others. And for much of my life, instead of supporting me, he actively worked to sabotage things I was trying to accomplish because he wanted me to be just like him and not who I wanted to be. To keep this from being a complete downer of an opener for the show, I will say I've made progress on cleaning up the house a bit. That's partially why this is late. And well, depending on how things go this week, I may have everything taken care of by next weekend. I hope I will, but we'll just have to see. I have the issue that a friend of mine is going to be moving here shortly, and I'm pledged to help them move, so that's going to eat into a lot of my free time to do anything if I don't get this place taken care of before she has to move. Just have to see how it goes. Now, I had planned to put this together like a normal news episode and was working on it, but I've been dealing with insomnia issues, and Fuzznuts has just decided to join me on my lap. Yes, you are. So I haven't been able to put this thing together. And then I saw a news story that put an entirely different perspective on items, on a big story that's been in the news. So I figured I would just scrap what I'd done so far and focus most of this episode on the news article because it covers, like I said, an important issue in a way that's not being talked about in the news, and it shows a failure of the media to not correctly get this information out. A story comes from Quartz, QZ.com. The problem with the narrative about 1,500 children lost by U.S. immigration authorities. It certainly sounds bad. The U.S. government has lost track of 1,475 undocumented immigrant children. An official admitted as much during a Senate committee meeting. It certainly sounds bad. The U.S. government has lost track of 1,475 undocumented children. An official admitted as much during a Senate committee hearing last month. Fairly, that admission has spurred widespread demand for more agency accountability. The problem is, as the Washington Post notes, is that many of those missing kids may well be with their parents or families, and they may have gone off the grid to deliberately avoid immigration and customs enforcement authorities. Tracking them down could end up endangering more children and families. The 1,500 children figure, now in wide circulation, comes from an official with the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement, who testified last month about children who had arrived at the Mexico-U.S. border without parents and were transferred into ORR custody. In a survey of 7,635 children, ORR had placed with adult sponsors contacted by the agency between October and December of last year. 6,075 were still living with their sponsors. 28 had run away, 5 have been deported, and 52 were living with someone else. The rest were missing. Now, I'm going to pause this for just a second and go over a couple of things that are, some are covered in the article and some are not. Those children were not forcibly separated from their parents. Those children were part of the, if you'll remember, a couple of years ago, there was a humanitarian crisis at the border, with the border being overwhelmed by refugees showing up. Those children were from that. And this those children were placed in the foster or sponsor homes, however you want to call them, by the Obama administration, not the Trump administration. And they were, again, not forcibly torn apart from their parents. Their parents, in many cases, sent them all alone to the U.S. because their parents were, things are so bad in their home country. I can remember somebody talking about this and saying that, the parents, in a lot of cases, were, devout Catholics, but they were so concerned about their daughters being raped that they were giving them birth control pills to ensure that, if the daughters did get raped, they were unlikely to get pregnant. And Fuzznuts is banging his tail against the microphone. That's that weird noise you've been hearing. Silly boy. But now, as somebody breaks down those numbers of the kids, and as the article points out, but the article doesn't go on to break down, this was just a sample of the children who are in the care of sponsors placed there by ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement. There are over 40,000 children almost 41,000 children that the ORR has placed in such homes. If you extrapolate the numbers based on the survey, that means potentially 8,000 children are unaccounted for. Now, again, this is, not necessarily, this appears to be a very bad situation. These children were entrusted to the government, and the government failed us. But, as the Quartz article points out, a lot of those kids, well, let me backtrack a little bit. This is how the placement was done with the sponsors. To quote from the Quartz article, there are 4 levels of sponsors according to ORR policy, beginning with parents, then siblings and close relatives, then distant relatives or unrelated adults, and finally, willing strangers or agencies. Potential sponsors, once identified, must apply for unification with the child and provide evidence of a relationship. If the applicant is approved, the child is released. The ORR tries not to hold kids extensively, and data from 2015 show that the that children spend an average of 34 days in custody before joining a sponsor. Now, there are photos circulating of what things are like for the kids before they get placed with a sponsor, and they're not great. So let's not pretend that this is, an ideal situation, regardless of who was in charge of the government. It wasn't good under Obama. It's not. It's even worse under Trump. But as the article points out, those 1,500 kids that are, thought to be quote unquote missing, that, there's a lot of possibilities. It could be that, they've been, they've gone, they've hidden themselves from the agency because they don't want to get deported, which, seems like it would be a strong possibility under this administration, considering all the shit that they're doing. But also, as this article points out, the definition of lost includes, we called them and nobody answered the phone on the times we called them, so we don't know where they are. That's true, but that doesn't mean the kids are in any danger. So that, that number, whether it's the 1,500 or the 8,000 number, needs to be looked at in light of what it actually means, which in this case means, we don't know. We really don't know. And it's not necessarily something to be concerned about if you trust the government to actually place the children with families or people they know. And that, I realize for some of you that's a pretty big if. And now, the Bush never thought I'd say I wish we still had Bush, but compared to Trump, I wish we still had Bush. Now, Sessions' announcement that, we're going to separate parents from their kids when they show up at the border, that is horrific. And it's actually a stupid and inefficient idea. You only do that to terrorize people. I mean, why would you separate, look, logically, why would you separate parents from their children if there was no indication that the parents were harming the children? Well, you wouldn't. And, just strictly from a logistical standpoint, it creates greater paperwork headaches for you, because you have to make sure that, if, say, the parents are granted asylum, their conditions meet, their circumstances meet the necessary conditions to be granted asylum in the U.S., then you have to be able to track down their children and also grant them asylum. Well, if the parents are in one concentration camp and the kids are in another concentration camp, which seems to be the methodology they're using, then you've got a hard time finding them and tracking them down. Also, if you're an intelligent human being, you don't turn the care of children over just to anybody. I mean, because obviously some people don't want to take care of kids. Other people are wholly unqualified to take care of kids. And if you don't have, procedures set up to deal with taking care of kids who don't have any parents around, that's a really big issue. And I mean, the other thing is, you've got to worry about, say, you're separating an infant from its mother. Well, then you've got to worry about the logistics of getting formula for the child, having somebody there, all the time to take care of the child, because it cannot be unsupervised for any period of time. Whereas, if you're dealing with a teenager, you can feed them adult food and you don't have to worry so much about them being unsupervised, although you can't let them run wild or you get Lord of the Flies, which is probably what's happening in some of those places. No, you split the kids up from their parents for one reason and one reason only: to scare the shit out of the people who are fleeing whatever nightmare they're fleeing to come to the United States. Because they hear, they're taking our kids and we may never see our kids again. Well, they at that point they're in the same situation if they come to the U.S. that if they stay where they are. So that, that's a horror show. Of course, some people are still going to risk it, thinking that maybe they'll be able to get through without getting caught, or that even if they're living in a camp, it's better than where they're living now. It's going to vary from individual to individual. I don't know. But we shouldn't put those missing 1,500 kids in Sessions' lap and saying it's a result of his current policy. That is not necessarily the case. Although I would be willing to bet a lot of those kids that, are accounted for are suddenly going to disappear in the wake of, the story about parents being separated from their kids. Not to mention the other horrors that are undoubtedly being unleashed upon people. And the internment camps that the kids, at least, are being put in are not pretty. There's a news story from a few years ago that has photos. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And, the kids are being housed in dog kennels. That's the only way to put it. And, at the time the article was written, the average stay of a kid was, I guess, about a month. The 30 days would be bad, but it wouldn't be as awful as the long-term conditions that regular refugees are going to be subjected to. And with the increase in the number of kids, or, people who've refugees that are being locked up under the Trump administration, those places aren't going to be able to handle it. The article, like I said, that I'll have linked to in the show notes, it's an improvised setup that they have. It's not horrific in the sense that, the kids are being tortured or whatever, but it's far from ideal. And of course, and that's only one facility. Who the hell knows what it's like in the other facilities? But with the increase in deportations, locking them up, the people who are, in this country illegally, they're in the privatized prisons, things can't be good, and they're only going to get worse with the government, putting more and more people in those situations. And I want to point out that it took 2 years for the Nazis to go from just rounding up people and putting them in camps to creating the industrialized killing operations that they had. Now, we've already got the camps. So, how long is it going to be before somehow some asshole decides, well, let's just start fucking killing all these assholes? I also want to point out that it's funny, somebody was willing to go into a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. and wave around a gun demanding to know what the fuck happened to all the kids that are, were being sold into the sex ring run by Hillary Clinton. Yet nobody on the right wing seems to be going out and waving guns in the face of Jeff Sessions and other government officials demanding to know what happened to these kids. Kind of odd. Maybe it's because, I don't know, these kids are brown, or they're not American, or, it's not Hillary running the government. I don't know. But it is. It's just good old-fashioned American double standards. And something I want to point out that hasn't been brought up very much in this discussion of the children being ripped from their parents is the story which happened almost 80 years ago, is that of the motor ship St. Louis. In 1939, it left Germany with over 900 Jewish refugees, and they sailed the U.S., Cuba, Canada, trying to escape the horror that was coming. Unfortunately, Cuba, the United States, and Canada all turned them away. However, they were happily resettled in Belgium, the Netherlands, France, and the UK. At least a quarter of of the people on the ship would later die in the death camps during the war. So, as an American, I'm fairly illiterate about what the fuck's going on in the rest of the world. I know Venezuela is turning into a shithole. I'm not sure what's going on in Argentina or other Latin American countries. There's a big strike in Brazil among truckers because they're upset over the high cost of diesel fuel. So I don't know why these people are fleeing their home countries to come to the U.S. But I don't like the idea that we could be shipping them off to a fate, that's pretty horrific. Which could happen if we're returning them to their home countries, or if we're locking them up in an awful immigration detention center. And, let's be clear here. Those immigration detention centers that we have don't all have a very good reputation, especially the ones run by the private prison companies, because they run them like a prison. And if you look at the stats on private prisons, they have, more inmate violence than government-run prisons. I believe they have a higher recidivism rate than other prisons do. And, they're just awful nightmare places. And this is where we're sending people who are so desperate to get out of their country and go to what many Americans would say is the greatest country on earth, that they're willing to risk life and limb for it. And our reward to these people is not, holy shit, you've got some balls, come on in. It's, fuck you, we don't want you here, we're locking you up. It reminds me, some years ago, 10 or 15 years ago now, there was a guy who was a Cuban, and he converted an old military truck into a boat and was sailing it to the U.S. Well, the Coast Guard spotted him, picked him up, rather than letting him continue on his way, which they would sometimes do if, somebody was in an ordinary boat. And then, and said, well, we had to rescue him. The truck wasn't really seaworthy and was going to sink any minute. And then because, they didn't want to leave it floating around as a hazard to navigation, they, sank it. Of course, it took them a very long time to actually sink the thing. But you look at a guy, and because he was that guy was picked up on the ocean, and not, they didn't catch him on the beach in Miami. He was returned to Cuba. Whereas, because the U.S. has the policy known as wet foot, dry foot. If you're picked up at sea, they send you back. If you're, found on land, they grant you asylum. Well, somebody with the kind of will and dedication to figure out how to convert a truck into an ocean-going vessel is somebody you want in your country. I mean, they've got skills. They've got good mechanical skills. I'm trained as a machinist. I couldn't do what that guy did, I don't think. Well, I know I couldn't do some of it because I don't know how to weld. Obviously, I could teach myself and all that, but that takes a hell of a lot of time to be able to do it, and you're literally putting your life in jeopardy. So you got a guy who's skilled, you got a guy who's willing to put in a superhuman effort to get out of his fucking country. Why wouldn't you want him here? And that guy later on, after he got sent back to Cuba, he made another attempt in a converted vehicle, and that failed. And his third attempt, he did it, but he had to go for, somehow it worked out, as I recall. He ended up in Mexico and then crossed the border into the U.S. from Mexico and was able to claim asylum that way. But, that's a guy he should never have had to go through all that shit to get here. That's that's somebody who, when they spotted him with the truck in the middle of the ocean, they should have said, son of a bitch, if he's coming to America, that's the kind of guy we want. But they didn't. So all the people who are upset about the government, losing track of 1,500 children, I think should redirect their anger at the shitty immigration policies we have more than they should be focused on the missing kids, because those kids may not be in any danger. Some of them probably are, just because statistically speaking, someone is always in some kind of danger when you're dealing with a large enough number of people. Almost 100 people a day in the U.S. die from guns. So, the odds are, when you're dealing with, a subject, like a large group of people, statistically speaking, some of them are going to be in danger, while the majority of them are not going to be. But, the outrage machine that we have, and yes, we do have an outrage machine, isn't very good at times like this in sorting out what needs to be conveyed to the public. The whole separating kids from their parents is awful. But that's a separate issue from these 1,500 kids who are missing. And that's not always being made clear. So I wanted to use my little pulpit to address part of that because I thought it was important. I'm no fan of Trump or Sessions or any of them in power, but let's make sure we lay the blame where it really belongs. In the case of the 1,500 missing kids, it's on the U.S. immigration policies, which have been in place probably since W, if not before, because we have. I think the last time we did any kind of comprehensive immigration reform was under Reagan. I know they changed immigration policy to some degree under Clinton, but that was not addressing issues like this, whereas under Reagan they gave asylum to various illegals. Under Clinton, what they had for a while, and they have got rid of it, and I don't remember if it was under Clinton or under Bush that they did, or W that they did this. But it was because to become a U.S. citizen, you have to live here for a period of 7 years before you can apply to take your citizenship test. And under Clinton, they had a deal where, you can donate a lot of money to the government and bypass that, which was how Rupert Murdoch became a U.S. citizen. Because the laws at the time, and I don't know if it's still the case or not, were that you couldn't own like a broadcast network if you were not a U.S. citizen. So Rupert did the fast track to citizenship in order to become a citizen so he could do Fox. God. That was an awful decision on our part to allow that to happen. And they've rescinded that policy at some point. I don't remember when it was, but it was, of course, it was after Rupert got his citizenship. All of which leaves us with the question, what do we do about this? Well, I will go back to what I have been saying for some time now. Get involved in politics. Show up at your local party meetings. Find them if you don't know where they are. If there isn't a local party in your area holding meetings, start holding them. We have to push back. If we don't, we are going down a very dangerous path. I mean, even if by some miracle the Democrats manage to sweep the elections in the midterms and in 2020, we have a lot of work to do to repair our democracy. We have to put in measures so that nothing like this can happen again. I mean, let's just say what everybody knows. The Republicans in Congress are complicit with Trump's corruption. And since the Republicans are the majority party in Congress, nothing can be done until they're gone. Though, the Mueller investigation will assume for the sake of argument that he gets dirt on everybody. Mueller is not going to file charges against Trump. The argument will be that, a sitting president is immune to prosecution. There is no court case establishing that. That is just the consensus amongst many in government. Mueller is one of those people who holds that position. So everybody else gets indicted, basically. And Trump is an unindicted co-conspirator. That's the best case scenario. But we have to have mechanisms in place so it doesn't get this bad again. So that if we have a president who is obviously corrupt and who has, his party has control of both houses of Congress, that there are, mechanisms so that he is removed from office. And we don't have to wait until an election to boot him out there. Because, the damage that is being done is not merely to our institutions of government. Well, there's our international reputation, which is now in the shitter. Not that it had been great here recently anyways, but it's absolutely in the shitter. We're doing untold amounts of environmental damage to the planet, and they're rolling back environmental regulations. That's going, and things like the environmental regulations are kind of key because they're going, the rollbacks will be forgotten by a great many people once the Democrats return to power, assuming they're able to, and that the Republicans haven't so rigged the electoral process, thanks to their friends, the Russians, in this country, that it's almost impossible to get Democrats elected. People will not remember that those, all these EPA regulations have been repealed. So getting them restored may be a very arduous process because, the appointee that the next president picks to head up the EPA, we don't know what their priorities are going to be. Their priorities may just be finding enough people to staff the agency because it's so short of help now. We need to make sure that anybody who's appointed to a cabinet position is qualified for that position and not just somebody who gave lots of money to, a political campaign. Things like demonstrations and protests are important because they signal not only to our elected officials that a great number of Americans do not agree with this policy or these actions by the government, but they also signal to the rest of the world that, hey, don't give up on us. There are some of us out there who are still trying to do the right thing. But they don't solve everything. And unless we have mechanisms in place to block all this, we're going to deal with it again. The pattern has been with the U.S. election is that a president will come in generally with this, a Congress that is tilted in their favor to some degree. Then they get about 2 years to do their goals. Then the midterms hit and party will shift in, power will shift in one of the houses or both of them away from the president's party. And then, when the next election rolls around, the president is generally reelected and the makeup of Congress will shift one way or the other or stay the same. I don't remember the figures on that second part. It's, I'm worried about I'm optimistic that Trump will only serve one term and the next president will be a Democrat who has support in Congress. That's not a guarantee. And, once we get statistically speaking, the midterms this year will not give the Democrats an overwhelming majority. There's just not enough seats up for election this year, because it's a midterm, to give the Democrats an overwhelming majority. They can, at best, hope for a slim majority in both houses, though they may get an overwhelming majority in the House. They certainly cannot get it in the Senate, because not every Senate seat is up this year for a vote. The largest number of Senate seats come up for a vote, I believe, in the presidential election years. So we have got, until 2020 before we have the possibility that the Democrats can gain. And then if by some miracle they manage to get control in 2020 by an overwhelming amount, starting in 2021, they have a lot of work ahead of them. And they need to be reminded of it, because there's certain ground rule, they have to lay the groundwork in certain areas to keep shit like this from happening. They have to do election reform. We cannot have voting machines that are easily hacked. They have to put in places to deal with Russian interference in our elections, because the Russians are going to keep doing it. And the Chinese will start doing it if they're not doing it already. And if, let's say, the next president fucks up, does something really stupid, and, turns public opinion against them and the Democrats, when the election rolls around in 2024 and the Republicans get control, they are really going to be pushing their agenda and not letting anything stop them, no matter what the laws are. So we have to be prepared to put in measures in place to control our government, to control a corrupt party, because that's what the Republicans are right now. And I'm not going to pretend that at some point the Democrats won't become corrupt. Power corrupts. It's a fact. And we have to structure our government so that it can accomplish the things we want it and we need it to do, and it can root out corruption. We don't have those mechanisms in place yet. And I'm not sure if we're going to, because it's really hard to, put those, it's not a sexy topic like immigration or voting or jobs or anything like that. It's the nuts and bolts, and that's where we need to be focused. So that's why I say, if you're not involved in your local politics, you need to get involved. If you're like me and you live in a red state and a red county and a red state, flipping, the town, the county, or the state to blue can solve some of your problems and be a bulwark against things. I mentioned the number on an earlier podcast, and I don't remember what it is, and I don't have time to look it up. But, if just like one or two more states flip to Republican-controlled governorships and state houses, they can start passing constitutional amendments real easy, because they will have a 2/3 majority of states under their control. We can't allow that. Now, we can make a great case for a lot of constitutional amendments out there, like the Equal Rights Amendment, passing an amendment that clarifies guns in this country so people, can't get access to, military-style weapons. But, I'd be willing to trade that off if we were just able to prevent the Republicans from doing what they wanted to do, since their policies are so horrific. And, I'll go back once again. I know everybody's probably tired of hearing me say it. Read Eric Hoffer's The True Believer. I'm now at the point I've decided that I'm going to get some extra copies of it, and at the next events where I'm at, that I know one of the candidates for governor is going to be there, and candidates for, the various state and local offices are going to be there. I'm going to hand them copies of the book and say, well, in the case of the governor, I'm not the guy running for governor, because he's got a fairly big operation. I'm just going to hand it to him and tell him let somebody on his staff read it, because I know he doesn't have time. But I'm going to hand copies of that book to all the political officials I can and say, please read this. This basically predicted Trump's campaign. It shows the direction we're headed if we don't change things, and it does give some advice on how to blunt his operations and change things for the better in this country. But we can only do that if people like you read this book, understand it, and, take the appropriate measures. Because if we don't do that, if we just sit back, let's say there's a Democratic wave, we get the ideal Democratic president, we get a Democratic Congress, and we just relax. We're going to wind up in this mess again. And probably really, really quickly. We have to work hard. And, once the Democrats get elected, if they do, we have to work even harder than we're working now, so that they know what things to put in place so we don't have to deal with this shit again. I know people like to compare the Republicans to the Nazis. There are differences, but the mindset, as Hoffer points out in his book, the fundamentalist terrorist type, whether they be, Muslim or Christian terrorist or or a political terrorist, their mindset is the same. What inspires them to go out and blow shit up and kill people might be different, but they have the same mindset. It's like cancer, Cancer is, we call, we refer to cancer as one disease, even though there are really multiple diseases that are types of cancer. And if we're going to survive as a society and quite possibly as a species, we have to put in place measures to prevent that kind of mindset from gaining control. And right now, the kind of people who are in control are the kind of people who would enable that mindset rather than disabling it. And, to fix it, it doesn't require us to do horrific things, to institute martial law or anything like that. In fact, those are counterproductive. What we have to do is deal with income inequality, deal with educational failures in this country, prison reform, and government reform, as I said before, dealing with making sure our elections can't be hacked and things like that. We do those things, and we will put in place measures that prohibit somebody from, like Trump, gaining power and wrecking the country. But that can only happen if each one of us works at it, and we have to push hard. We have to make it a priority. It has to be, our top priority is undoing the damage and putting in measures to prevent that kind of damage from being done again. Okay. I have got to get out of here. I have got just a little bit of time to catch a nap before I go to work. I don't know how long I'll be working tonight, but I'll get this thing out in the morning. To you, apologies for the delays and that weird noise. I bumped my spit screen on my mic. No, I'll try and edit that out if I can. Next week will be more of the Rastafarian Apocrypha, and I will talk to you then.
That's it for this episode of The Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, as well as just about anywhere else podcasts can be found. Many of the episodes are also on YouTube. Follow the show on Twitter. @TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle. It's on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist.com. If you happen to like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's a donate button on the show notes page. You can support it via Patreon at patreon.com/TNTucker. Thanks for listening.
Say goodnight, Fuzz-Nuts.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.
Damned cat.